The afternoon sun cascaded through Elite Motors' floor-to-ceiling windows, casting prismatic reflections off the metallic surfaces of luxury vehicles. Among them, a metallic silver Aston Martin Vantage commanded attention, its curves seeming to defy gravity. Victoria Bennett adjusted her Hermes scarf, her fingers brushing against the small velvet box in her coat pocket, a reminder of why she was here. Behind the counter, Blake Thompson's booming laughter echoed off the marble floors as he entertained his usual clientele, unaware that his world was about to change forever. Some lessons, after all, come at a price higher than any car on his showroom floor. Have you ever faced discrimination in a luxury store? Before we dive into this powerful story, take a moment to share where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Your experience matters to our community. Victoria Bennett had always measured her life in achievements rather than years. At 52, her resume read like a testament to breaking barriers: CEO of Bennett Financial Group, board member of multiple Fortune 500 companies, and a self-made millionaire who built her empire from scratch. Yet, sitting in Dr. Anderson's office 3 months ago, all those accomplishments seemed to fade into insignificance as she heard the word stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came during her annual checkup, a routine she'd maintained religiously since watching her husband, Marcus S.R., succumb to a heart attack 20 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. Despite all her careful planning, life had its own agenda. The doctor estimated 6 months, perhaps 8, with aggressive treatment. Victoria had simply nodded, her mind already racing not to her own mortality but to her son Marcus Jr., and the legacy she needed to secure before time ran out. In the weeks that followed, Victoria kept the diagnosis private, sharing it only with her personal attorney. She began methodically organizing her affairs, but not in the way most terminal patients did. Instead of writing a traditional will, she crafted a master plan, one final lesson in justice and compassion that she would teach through her actions rather than words. Every morning, as she stood before her penthouse windows overlooking the city she'd helped build, Victoria would touch the small photograph she kept in her blazer pocket, a grainy image of herself and young Marcus outside their first one-bedroom apartment, both smiling despite their struggles. That smile, she decided, would be her final gift to the world. Not the forced grin of a woman facing death, but the knowing smile of someone about to orchestrate one last magnificent play. The Elite Motors incident wasn't just another case of discrimination for Victoria, it was an opportunity to create lasting change. As she prepared herself for what would likely be her final battle, she thought about all the others who had faced similar treatment but lacked the resources to fight back. Her diagnosis wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. Sometimes, she mused, it takes the prospect of death to truly teach people how to live. In her designer handbag, alongside the medical reports and business documents, she carried a list of names, people whose lives she planned to touch before her time ran out. Blake Thompson's name wasn't originally on that list, but fate had other plans. Marcus Bennett Jr. was the living embodiment of everything Victoria had fought for. At 32, he'd already made partner at Preston Howard, one of the nation's most prestigious law firms, specializing in both corporate law and civil rights litigation, a combination that raised eyebrows but perfectly reflected the values his mother had instilled in him. Their Sunday dinners were a sacred tradition, held in Victoria's penthouse overlooking the city skyline. These weren't just meals, they were intimate strategy sessions where mother and son would discuss everything from landmark court cases to community initiatives. Last Sunday, unbeknownst to Marcus, Victoria had watched him with particular intensity, memorizing every detail of his face, knowing their remaining dinners were numbered. "You remember what your father used to say?" Victoria had asked, swirling her untouched wine. "Success isn't just about climbing the ladder, it's about sending the elevator back down for others." Marcus nodded, his father's words as familiar as his mother's strength. What he didn't know was how literally Victoria had taken that philosophy lately, anonymously funding scholarships and small business loans across the city. Their journey hadn't been easy. After Marcus S.R.'s death, Victoria had worked as a junior accountant by day and attended law school by night, often bringing young Marcus to evening classes where he'd fall asleep amid the sound of legal terminology. Those nights sparked his passion for law, though neither realized it at the time. While other kids played with toys, Marcus played with his mother's law books, absorbing concepts far beyond his years. Victoria had taught him to turn discrimination into determination. When his third-grade teacher suggested he might be more comfortable in a less advanced class, Victoria not only fought the school board but also spent every evening helping Marcus excel until he topped his class. That victory became their blueprint. Success was the best response to prejudice. Together, they'd built an impressive legacy. Victoria's financial acumen combined with Marcus's legal expertise had created a formidable force for change in the business world. They were known for not just winning battles but transforming the battlefield itself, creating opportunities for others along the way. But their closest moments weren't in boardrooms or courtrooms. They came during quiet evenings when Marcus would find his mother in her home office, looking at old photographs and making lists of people to help. He never knew she was preparing him for a world without her, strengthening their bond while she still had time. Mother, Marcus had said just last week, "You've been different lately." More. Intentional, Victoria had simply smiled, touching the velvet box in her pocket, the one containing the Aston Martin keys she planned to surprise him with. "Just making sure every moment counts," she'd replied, fighting back tears as she thought of the medical file hidden in her desk drawer. Her son was ready for the world she. Blake Thompson's corner office at Elite Motors told a carefully curated story of success, but like many well-crafted narratives, it concealed more than it revealed. Behind the polished awards and magazine covers featuring his rags to riches, story lay a more complex truth that haunted him daily, especially when he looked at the worn photograph hidden in his desk drawer, a reminder of debts unpaid and promises broken. 25 years ago, Blake had been on the verge of bankruptcy, his first dealership failing during the economic downturn. It was Marcus Bennett's SR, Victoria's late husband, who had extended a lifeline through an anonymous investment fund. Blake never learned his benefactor's identity, but the investment came with a handwritten note: "Everyone deserves a second chance. Make it count." He'd kept that note, now yellow with age, in his wallet, a reminder of both shame and salvation. The cruel irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. His teenage daughter Sarah's rare blood condition required expensive treatments that consumed most of his liquid assets, forcing him to maintain a facade of success while privately selling his possessions. The recent offer to acquire Elite Motors could solve everything, but the buyer's due diligence period meant any scandal could destroy the deal, and with it, Sarah's chance for treatment. Blake's transformation from grateful recipient of help to hardened discriminator hadn't happened overnight. Years of operating in luxury circles had taught him that exclusivity sold better than inclusivity. He'd convinced himself that his actions were just business, not personal, or rationalization that grew easier with each passing year. The same man who once couldn't afford a used car now routinely turned away customers he deemed unsuitable for his brand. But behind his marble and glass fortress, Blake secretly funded a small nonprofit helping underprivileged youth learn automotive repair skills. He did it anonymously, just as his mysterious benefactor had helped him, perhaps trying to balance his public persona with private penance. Every month he would visit the garage after hours, watching young people discover their passion for cars, remembering his own humble beginnings. Sarah's illness had started to crack his carefully constructed facade. Each hospital visit reminded him of his own vulnerability, of the arbitrary nature of life's challenges. Yet, instead of softening his heart, the stress had hardened it further. He became more controlling at work, more dismissive of those he considered beneath him, as if maintaining strict social hierarchies could somehow protect him from his own precarious position. The morning of Victoria Bennett's visit, Blake had received another medical bill for Sarah's treatments. The amount would have bought several of the luxury cars in his showroom. As he stared at the figure, his hand instinctively touched the old note in his wallet. For a moment, he almost remembered what it felt like to need help, to be judged unworthy. But then his first customers arrived, and the mask slipped back into place, the mask of Blake Thompson, luxury car dealer, arbiter of worth, a man who had forgotten that everyone eventually needs a second chance. The silver Aston Martin Vantage gleamed under the showroom lights as Victoria approached it, her reflection ghosting across its polished surface. She ran her fingers along its smooth contours, remembering how Marcus S.R. had once promised to buy her one when they made it. The irony of finally being able to afford two, one for her and one for Marcus Jr. just as her time was running out, wasn't lost on her. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I'm interested in this model." Blake Thompson's head turned slowly, his ice blue eyes sweeping over her Chanel suit and Hermes scarf with unconcealed disdain. Despite her elegant attire and sophisticated bearing, his lip curled slightly at the corners. Perhaps he drawled, each word dripping with condescension. "You'd be more comfortable at our used car location across town." He shared a knowing smirk with another salesperson. "This particular vehicle is rather exclusive. The Vantage represents the pinnacle of British engineering and luxury." Victoria's spine stiffened imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady, honed by decades of dealing with men who underestimated her. "I'm quite familiar with Aston Martin's reputation," she replied, her tone professional and measured. "I'm particularly interested in the performance specifications and available customization options." Blake's laugh echoed through the showroom, drawing the attention of other customers, mostly older white men in expensive suits accompanied by much younger women. "Ma'am," he said, emphasizing the word mockingly, "this Aston Martin costs more than most people make in 5 years. I wouldn't want to waste your time." "You're wasting it right now," Victoria responded, her voice now reaching every corner of the suddenly quiet showroom. "And you'll continue to waste it until you show me this car." She withdrew her phone, preparing to make a call that would end this charade, but then stopped herself. Sometimes, she reminded herself, the greatest lessons require patience. Blake's amusement turned to irritation, his carefully maintained veneer of sophistication cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. He stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way meant to intimidate. "Look," he said, his voice hardening, "we have certain standards here at Elite Motors. We cater to a certain clientele. I'm sure you understand." Victoria stood her ground, thinking of the medical report in her bag, of all the battles she'd fought to get here, of the lessons she still needed to teach her son about justice and dignity. The terminal diagnosis had given her an unusual freedom, the luxury of not having to calculate long-term consequences. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said calmly, knowing full well what his response would be. "I own this dealership," Blake declared proudly, his chest puffing out, "and I'm asking you to leave." Now, when Victoria didn't move, his face reddened, the flush creeping up from his collar to his hairline. "Security," he called out, reaching for his phone. "And I'm calling the police. We don't need your kind causing trouble here." As security approached, Victoria noticed a small photograph falling from Blake's wallet, a teenage girl in a hospital bed, smiling weakly at the camera. She caught a glimpse of the hospital's letterhead before Blake hastily snatched the photo back. "Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center." For a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them, a flash of shared understanding quickly buried under layers of prejudice and pride. Little did Blake know this confrontation would set in motion events that would change not just their lives but the very nature of justice and redemption in their community. The handcuffs bit into Victoria's wrists with cold indifference as the police officers led her through the showroom. The wine-colored silk of her dress rustled softly, a stark contrast to the sterile whiteness of Elite Motors' pristine floor. Blake Thompson's laughter followed her to the door, a sound that would soon haunt his dreams. "Next time, know your place," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others recording discreetly on their phones. One elderly gentleman in a bespoke suit actually removed his glasses, wiped them, and shook his head in disgust, not at Victoria but at Blake. As she was escorted to the police car, Victoria held her head high, even as her mind raced to her own hospital appointment scheduled for the following week. The irony of potentially spending her precious remaining time dealing with this situation wasn't lost on her. Yet there was a strange peace in knowing that her response to this moment could be her final gift to society. "Ma am, we need to take you to the station," one officer said quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. His partner was already on the radio running Victoria's credentials. She could tell by their demeanor that they'd rather not be involved in this situation. Inside the dealership, Blake was already spinning his tale to the remaining customers, painting himself as the victim of attempted fraud and aggression. "You see how they try to take advantage," he said to a young couple examining a Bentley. "You have to be firm. Standards must be maintained." What Blake didn't notice was one of his regular customers, Judge William Harrison, quietly walking out of the dealership, phone in hand, already dialing his good friend Marcus Bennett Jr., whose reputation in legal circles was well known to him. The police car pulled away from Elite Motors just as Victoria's phone began buzzing incessantly in her purse, still sitting on the showroom counter. Among the missed calls would be one from her oncologist, Dr. Anderson, with critical news about an experimental treatment program and an unexpected connection to Blake Thompson's daughter, Sarah. Back in the showroom, Blake retrieved Victoria's purse, intending to hand it over to the police as evidence. As he lifted it, a medical document slipped out, a referral letter from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. His hands trembled slightly as he read the header, identical to the ones in his daughter's file at home. For a brief moment, his mask of superiority cracked, but he quickly shoved the document back into the purse, refusing to acknowledge the pang of recognition. "Sir," a young security guard approached hesitantly. "There's something you should see." He held out his phone, showing a social media post already going viral, a video of the entire incident captured by one of the customers. The comments section was exploding with outrage, and among them was a particularly damning one. "Is this the same Blake Thompson who received anonymous help to start his business 25 years ago? Karma has a long memory." Blake's face paled as he read the comment, his hand automatically reaching for the worn note in his wallet, the one that had accompanied that mysterious investment so many years ago. As he touched the yellowed paper, his daughter Sarah's face flashed in his mind. Along with her doctor's words from yesterday, "We found a potential donor match, Mr. Thompson. Someone in our database. But given your recent financial statements." The sound of sirens faded into the distance as Blake stood in his empty showroom, unaware that his actions today had set in motion a chain of events that would force him to confront not just his prejudices, but the very foundation of his success. As Victoria sat in the police station's holding area, her mind drifted back 25 years to a different waiting room. She remembered Marcus S.R. sitting beside her, reviewing investment portfolios while they waited for their real estate lawyer. Sometimes, Vicky had said, the best investments are in people who've lost their way that day. They had anonymously invested in several struggling businesses, including a small car dealership owned by a desperate young man named Blake Thompson. The memory shifted to another scene, Marcus S.R.'s funeral 3 years later. Through her grief, she'd noticed a man standing far back among the mourners, clutching a worn piece of paper. She realized now it had been Blake, though she hadn't recognized him then. He'd left before she could speak to him, leaving behind a single note: "He gave me a second chance." I'll never forget the note had been signed simply "A grateful recipient." In another corner of the city, at that exact moment, Marcus Jr. was pulling files from his father's old study. As he searched for documentation of his mother's arrest, a yellowed envelope fell from between the pages of an old ledger. Inside was a photograph his father shaking hands with a younger Blake Thompson, both smiling in front of a modest used car lot. On the back was written, "Remember, son, true wealth isn't in what we keep, but in what we give away. Dad." Meanwhile, at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Sarah Thompson sat in her treatment room flipping through old magazines to pass time during her chemotherapy. She paused at a familiar face, Victoria Bennett, featured in an article about anonymous philanthropy in healthcare. The article mentioned Victoria's substantial donations to cancer research, specifically in rare blood disorders. Sarah's own condition was mentioned as a case study, though she didn't realize the connection. Back at Elite Motors, Blake stood in his office, staring at the medical document from Victoria's purse. His hands trembled as he read the oncologist named Dr. Anderson, the same doctor treating Sarah. A sudden memory surfaced: last week's conversation with the hospital's financial department. They'd mentioned a potential donor for Sarah had been found, someone already in their system, someone who had specifically requested anonymity. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture Blake wasn't ready to see. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the original investment letter from 25 years ago. For the first time, he noticed the handwriting matched some notes on Victoria's medical documents. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The woman he'd just had arrested was not only his long-ago benefactor, but possibly also his daughter's last hope. In the police station, Victoria finally received her phone call. Instead of contacting Marcus or her lawyers, she dialed Dr. Anderson. "I've seen Sarah Thompson's file," she said quietly. "I want to confirm my anonymous donor status. And yes, I understand the risks of donation during my own treatment." She paused, listening to the doctor's concerns. "Some things are more important than a few extra months of life, doctor. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is a second chance, even to those who may not seem to deserve it." As day turned to evening, these hidden threads of connection pulled tighter, drawing together lives that had been intersecting for decades without knowing it. The story unfolding wasn't just about discrimination or revenge, it was about legacy, redemption, and the price we pay for our prejudices. And in the gathering darkness, none of the players yet realized how their past choices would shape their remaining time together. If this story about second chances and hidden connections touches your heart, take a moment to hit that like button. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of redemption. In the dimly lit holding cell, Victoria closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting to a rain-soaked evening 25 years ago. She and Marcus S.R. had been reviewing investment opportunities when they came across Blake Thompson's desperate loan application. The young dealer's passion had reminded Marcus S.R. of his own beginnings, and despite the bank's rejections, they had seen potential beneath the desperation. "Everyone deserves dignity," Vic Marcus S.R. had said, signing the investment documents. "Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them." They had structured the investment through their anonymous charitable foundation, adding only a handwritten note about second chances. That same night, they had celebrated the decision over dinner, unaware it would be one of their last meals together. Now, sitting on the hard bench, Victoria withdrew a folded newspaper clipping from her wallet, a small article about Sarah Thompson's condition that she'd been carrying for weeks. She had first learned about Blake's daughter through Dr. Anderson, who mentioned the case during one of Victoria's own cancer consultations. The coincidence had seemed like fate's hand at work. "Mrs. Bennett," a young officer appeared at the cell door. "There's something you should know. We found some irregularities in Mr. Thompson's complaint." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "And Judge Harrison called. He was there, saw everything. He's demanding your immediate release." As Victoria gathered her belongings at the front desk, her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Anderson: "Urgent need to discuss donor match for Sarah Thompson." "Time sensitive due to your condition." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she read the message, remembering her own recent prognosis. Meanwhile, across town, in Sarah's hospital room, Blake sat beside his sleeping daughter, clutching a stack of overdue medical bills. On the nightstand lay a foundation brochure featuring an anonymous donor program, the same program Victoria had established years ago in Marcus S.R.'s memory. Sarah had circled the contact information, hopefully unaware of the day's events. Victoria's driver pulled up outside the police station, but instead of heading home, she directed him to Memorial Sloan Kettering. In her purse was the velvet box containing the Aston Martin keys, her planned surprise for Marcus Jr. Now accompanied by a growing stack of documentation linking her family's past with the Thompsons. Dr. Anderson was waiting in his office, gray-haired, disheveled, glasses slightly askew. "Victoria," he began, "you understand the risks. Donating bone marrow in your condition," he trailed off, studying her face. "It could significantly reduce your remaining time." Victoria smiled softly, touching the old investment note she'd kept all these years. "Doctor, I've spent my life making investments in people. Sometimes the returns aren't what we expect, but that doesn't make them less valuable." She paused, looking out the window at the setting sun. "How long would the donation give Sarah?" "With a perfect match like yours, potentially a full recovery. But Victoria, you have to understand this level of physical stress could reduce your time to mere weeks." Victoria nodded, remembering Marcus S.R.'s words about dignity and second chances. The irony wasn't lost on her that Blake Thompson's greatest act of discrimination might lead to his daughter's salvation through the very person he'd wronged. It was a lesson in humanity more powerful than any revenge could be. "Schedule the procedure," she said finally, "but maintain my anonymity. Some gifts need to be given without recognition to be truly understood." She thought of Blake's face in the showroom, of Sarah's hopeful circles on the brochure, of Marcus S.R.'s belief in human potential. "And doctor, there's something else you should know about the Thompsons." As Victoria began to share the full story of her connection to the Thompson family, neither she nor Dr. Anderson noticed Marcus Jr. Standing in the doorway, case files in hand, his expression shifting from concern to understanding as he began to piece together the complex web of relationships that had led to this moment. In his father's old study, Marcus Jr. sat surrounded by boxes of documents, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. What had started as a search for legal ammunition against Blake Thompson had turned into an archaeological dig into his family's past. His fingers traced the edges of a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age and heavy with secrets. "Son," his mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles, but from understanding why they need to be fought." He hadn't fully grasped her meaning until now, as he stared at the photographs spread before him, his father and Blake Thompson, standing together outside a modest used car lot, their smiles genuine and unburdened by the complexities that would follow. The ledger told a story that challenged everything Marcus thought he knew. Entry after entry detailed anonymous investments in struggling businesses, with Blake's dealership featuring prominently. His father's careful notations went beyond mere financial records. They included personal observations about each recipient's character, their families, their struggles. Next to Blake's name, Marcus S.R. had written a man worth believing in, despite his rough edges. Sometimes the hardest shells protect the softest hearts. As Marcus dug deeper, he discovered letters exchanged between his father and Blake, correspondence that spoke of dreams, gratitude, and promises made. One letter particularly caught his eye, dated just weeks before his father's unexpected death. Blake had written about his newborn daughter, Sarah, and his hopes for her future. The letter ended with a pledge: "I'll never forget what you've done for me. One day I'll pay it forward. Your investment wasn't just in my business, it was in my humanity." The irony of Blake's current behavior wasn't lost on Marcus. How had the grateful recipient of such kindness become the very embodiment of discrimination? As he pondered this, another document slipped from between the pages: a hospital bill from Sarah's first diagnosis, paid in full by an anonymous donor. The signature on the payment authorization was his mother's. Marcus's phone buzzed, displaying a message from Judge Harrison about his mother's arrest. But his attention was caught by an old photograph that had fallen from the ledger: his father at a charity gala, standing between Blake and a young doctor who looked remarkably like Dr. Anderson, Victoria's current oncologist. On the back, his father had written the Three Musketeers of Memorial Sloan Kettering's Children's Wing fundraiser. Some bonds transcend business. A pattern was emerging, one that spoke of connections deeper than mere coincidence. Marcus began laying out the documents chronologically, creating a timeline that spanned decades. The story they told was more complex than simple discrimination or revenge. It was about broken promises, forgotten kindnesses, and the cyclic nature of human behavior. His father's final letter to Blake, never sent, lay at the bottom of the box. Remember, it read, "The measure of a man isn't in the cars he sells or the wealth he accumulates, but in the lives he touches. When my time comes, I trust you'll remember our conversations about legacy and justice. Take care of your daughter, Blake, and never forget that true luxury isn't in what we possess, but in what we give away." Marcus sat back, running his hands through his hair. The legal strategy he'd been planning seemed hollow now, overshadowed by the weight of history and unspoken obligations. His phone buzzed again, this time a message from Dr. Anderson's office about an urgent matter concerning his mother. As he gathered the documents, Marcus noticed one final note in his father's handwriting, tucked into the ledger's cover for Marcus Jr. When the time comes to understand that justice and mercy are two sides of the same coin. The time, it seemed, had come sooner than anyone expected. Sarah Thompson lay in her hospital bed at Memorial Sloan Kettering, her once vibrant auburn hair now hidden beneath a colorful silk scarf, a gift from one of the anonymous donors to the Children's Wing. The 17-year-old's walls were covered with car designs she'd sketched during long treatment sessions, dreams of following in her father's footsteps before her rare blood condition had derailed everything. Through her window, she could see the same Aston Martin dealership billboard that had been her father's pride for years. Elite Motors, where luxury meets legacy, it proclaimed. Sarah smiled wryly at the irony. Lately, their own legacy seemed to be slipping away, one medical bill at a time. She'd overheard the nurses discussing how her father had been liquidating assets, selling his prized car collection piece by piece to fund her treatments. Dr. Anderson entered the room, his characteristic warm smile tinged with something else today, excitement perhaps. "Sarah," he began, settling into the chair beside her bed, "we found a match." The words hung in the air like a precious bubble neither dared to burst. A perfect match, actually, someone already in our system. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her sketchbook, the one where she'd drawn her future, page after page of the garage she planned to open, specializing in high-end car restoration. But the costs, she started, knowing how their insurance had already maxed out. "The donor has arranged to cover everything," Dr. Anderson assured her, carefully omitting Victoria's name. "They've requested anonymity, but there's something else you should know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The donor is also a patient here, fighting their own battle, their choice to help you. It comes at a personal cost." Outside in the hallway, Blake Thompson stood frozen, having overheard everything. His hand clutched a fresh stack of rejection letters from potential investors, the last hope he'd had for funding Sarah's treatment. The bitter taste of irony filled his mouth as he remembered how he'd treated Victoria Bennett just hours ago. Sarah's voice drifted through the door. "Strong despite her weakness, Dad always says we shouldn't accept charity." She couldn't see her father flinch at those words. "He says the Thompson name stands for something." Dr. Anderson's response was gentle but firm. "Sometimes, Sarah, accepting help with grace is stronger than refusing it with pride. Your father's success story, did you know it began with someone believing in him? Someone who gave him a chance when no one else would." Blake slid down the wall outside, his head in his hands. The memory of that first anonymous investment 25 years ago crashed over him like a wave. The worn note in his wallet seemed to burn. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Make it count." Inside the room, Sarah was examining the consent forms, her artist's fingers tracing the lines that could lead to her recovery. "The donor," she asked hesitantly, "will I ever get to thank them?" "They're not doing this for thanks," Dr. Anderson replied. Thinking of Victoria's quiet determination during their earlier meeting, they believe in second chances, and sometimes the greatest thank you is what we do with those chances. Blake listened to his daughter's pen scratch against the consent forms, each stroke a reminder of his own fall from grace. The security footage from Elite Motors played in his mind Victoria Bennett being led away in handcuffs, her dignity intact despite his attempts to shame her. And now, unknowingly, she held his daughter's life in her hands. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad, you can come in now. I've made my decision." Blake stood, straightening his tie habit from happier days. As he entered the room, he saw his daughter smiling, really smiling for the first time in months. The consent forms lay signed on her lap, a beautiful irony in black and white. In his corner office at Preston Howard, Marcus Jr. spread the documents across his desk like pieces of a complex puzzle. Late evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across photographs, letters, and financial records spanning 25 years. What had begun as preparation for a discrimination lawsuit had evolved into something far more intricate. "Dear Blake," one letter from his father read, dated just months before his death. "The investment in Elite Motors was never about the money. It was about believing in someone's potential for change. Remember our agreement about the children's wing at Memorial Sloan Kettering?" Marcus's eyes narrowed as he cross-referenced the dates with hospital records. The pediatric oncology wing had received a substantial anonymous donation the same year Blake's dealership became profitable. His laptop pinged with an urgent email from a private investigator. The attached files revealed a pattern that made Marcus's blood run cold. Blake Thompson hadn't just forgotten his benefactor's kindness, he'd actively worked to bury the connection. Property records showed that Blake had systematically purchased and demolished the original used car lot where he'd started, the same lot where the photograph with Marcus S.R. had been taken. All local newspaper records of the original business had been quietly bought and destroyed. But the most damning discovery came from a series of encrypted emails between Blake and Marcus S.R.'s former business partner, James Whitman. The correspondence, dated weeks before his father's fatal heart attack, detailed a scheme to divert funds from the anonymous investment foundation. His father had discovered the plan, threatening to expose both men. The last email was chilling. Heart attacks can be so unpredictable, especially in men under stress. Marcus's hands shook as he reached for his phone to call Detective Sarah Chin, but another document caught his eye, a recent medical report about Blake's daughter. Sarah Thompson's rare blood condition required a specific bone marrow match, and the only compatible donor in the database was Victoria Bennett. His mother's signature was on the donor consent forms, dated the same day as her arrest at Elite Motors. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. His father's death might not have been natural. Blake's discrimination wasn't just prejudice, it was a desperate attempt to maintain control as his carefully constructed world crumbled under the weight of medical bills and guilt. And now, in a twist of fate that seemed almost scripted, his mother held the key to saving the daughter of the man who might have been involved in his father's death. A soft knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Judge Harrison entered, his face grave. "Marcus, there's something else you need to see." He placed a sealed envelope on the desk. "Your father left this with me to be opened only if questions ever arose about his death. I think it's time." Inside was a memory card and a handwritten note. "Son, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth about Blake and James. But remember what I taught you: justice without mercy is just another form of vengeance. Look deeper. There's always more to the story." Marcus plugged the memory card into his laptop. Video footage began playing, security camera recordings from his father's office the night before his death. The conversation between Marcus S.R. and Blake revealed another layer. Blake had been manipulated by James Whitman, who had evidence of Blake's own father's illegal activities. Blake's choices had been driven by blackmail and desperation. As the video ended, Marcus's phone lit up with a text from Dr. Anderson. "Your mother insisted on proceeding with the donation. Given her condition, you need to come quickly. And Marcus, there's something about your father's death she never told you." The sun had fully set now, leaving Marcus alone in his office with the ghostly glow of his laptop screen and the weight of decisions no son should have to make. Justice for his father's salvation for Sarah Thompson, his mother's sacrifice, all threads in a tapestry of redemption and revenge that had been weaving itself for 25 years. In his drawer lay the legal papers that could destroy Blake Thompson forever. Next to them, the donor consent forms that could save his daughter. Marcus reached for both, knowing his next decision would define not just the future, but how the past would be remembered. The setting sun cast long shadows across Blake Thompson's office at Elite Motors as he frantically dialed numbers on his speakerphone, sweat beading on his forehead. On his desk lay 2 documents that threatened to destroy everything: a preliminary sales agreement for Elite Motors worth $50 million, and a medical bill for Sarah's next round of treatment that he couldn't possibly afford without the sale. Mr. Whitaker, Blake spoke into the phone, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "I assure you the incident this afternoon was a misunderstanding." On his computer screen, social media exploded with videos of Victoria Bennett's arrest. The hashtag Elite Motors discrimination was trending nationally. The deal can still proceed as planned. James Whitaker, CEO of Luxury Automotive Group, cleared his throat. "Blake, our investors are concerned. A discrimination lawsuit could tank the company's value before we even complete the acquisition. Perhaps we should revisit the terms." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. As if on cue, Blake's personal phone lit up with a text from Sarah's doctor treatment window closing. Decision needed within 48 hours. His daughter's life hung in the balance, dependent on a deal that was unraveling because of his own prejudice. Desperate, Blake pulled out his final bargaining chip, a worn envelope containing evidence of James Whitman's old schemes, the same ones that had entangled him in his mentor's death years ago. His hands trembled as he considered using it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to become the very thing he despised: someone using leverage to destroy lives. A knock at his door made him jump. His assistant entered, her face pale. "Mr. Thompson, Judge Harrison's office called. They're launching an official inquiry into the arrest. And there's someone here to see you about Sarah's case." Blake looked up to see Dr. Anderson standing in his doorway, holding a familiar medical file. The doctor's expression was unreadable as he placed a donor consent form on Blake's desk. "We found a match," he said quietly. "But there's something you need to know about the donor." Before Dr. Anderson could continue, Blake's phone buzzed again. Luxury Automotive Group's lawyers were requesting an emergency meeting. The deal was falling apart in real time. Each notification sounded like another nail in his daughter's coffin. In desperation, Blake called the one person he'd sworn never to contact: James Whitman. The old schemer answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. "Blake, my boy, trouble in paradise." "I need your help, James." One last time the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Whitman's laugh crackled through the phone. "Interesting timing. I just had a fascinating conversation with young Marcus Bennett. Smart boy, asking all the right questions about his father's death. Questions you don't want answered, I imagine." Blake's world spun as he realized the full scope of his situation. To save the deal and his daughter, he'd have to align with the man who had orchestrated his mentor's death. To save his reputation, he'd have to bury the truth even deeper. Dr. Anderson cleared his throat, still standing patiently with the consent form. "Mr. Thompson, about the donor." But Blake held up his hand, making a decision that would haunt him forever. He reached for James Whitman's evidence, preparing to use it as leverage to save the deal. "Whatever it takes," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. At that exact moment, his computer pinged with a new email. The subject line froze his blood. "From the desk of Marcus Bennett Jr. re Marcus Bennett Sr. Death and Sarah's treatment." The walls of Blake's carefully constructed world were crumbling, Each attempt to shore up one weakness exposed another. As he stared at the email, then at Dr. Anderson's consent form, then at Whitman's evidence, he realized he was running out of moves. His assistant appeared again, her voice shaking. "Sir? Mrs. Bennett's lawyers are here. And Sarah's calling from the hospital. She's asking about the anonymous donor." Blake looked at his reflection in the darkening window, a desperate man trying to save everything by risking it all. The question was no longer whether he would fall, but how many others he would drag down with him in his descent. In her private room at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Victoria Bennett sat by the window watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over Manhattan. The bone marrow donation procedure was scheduled for tomorrow morning, a decision that had surprised even her. On her lap lay 2 files: Sarah Thompson's medical history and Marcus S.R. Dott's last investigation into Blake Thompson's dealings. Sometimes she whispered to herself, remembering her late husband's words, "The hardest thing isn't knowing what's right, but doing it when everything in you screams for vengeance." Her phone buzzed with another message from Marcus Jr., warning her about the risks of the procedure in her weakened state. She smiled sadly, knowing her son still didn't understand that this wasn't just about saving Sarah. Dr. Anderson had been clear the donation would likely reduce her remaining time from months to weeks. Yet, as Victoria studied Sarah's photograph, the girl's hopeful smile so reminiscent of her father's younger days, she felt an odd peace about her decision. Revenge could destroy Blake Thompson's business, but forgiveness might save his soul. "Mrs. Bennett," a nurse entered with her evening medications. "Your son called again. He says he's found something about Mr. Thompson and his father's death." Victoria nodded, having expected this. The truth had a way of surfacing, like bodies in a flood. She reached for her journal, where she'd been writing letters to Marcus Jr. to be delivered after her death. The latest entry reads, "Son, by the time you read this, you'll know everything about your father's death. But remember, revenge is a poor substitute for justice, and justice without mercy is just another form of violence." The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, preparing to save the daughter of a man who had not only humiliated her but might have been involved in her husband's death. Yet, as she reviewed Sarah's latest test results, she remembered Blake's face 25 years ago, young, desperate, full of potential before fear and prejudice had hardened him. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for her phone to call Dr. Anderson. The screen displayed missed calls from reporters, civil rights attorneys, and supporters eager to champion her cause against elite motors. They all wanted a story of revenge, of justice served cold. None of them understood that sometimes the greatest victory comes from breaking the cycle of hatred. "You would be proud, Marcus," she whispered to her late husband's photograph. "Our son has your sense of justice, but he needs to learn what you taught me about mercy." She touched the small scar on her wrist where Blake's handcuffs had cut into her skin during the arrest. The physical mark would fade, but the lesson it taught could transform lives. A text message illuminated her phone, a photo from Marcus Jr. of the old investment note they'd sent Blake, along with evidence of his subsequent betrayal. Her finger hovered over the option to release everything to the press. One button could destroy Blake Thompson's world, just as he had tried to humiliate her. Instead, Victoria opened her email and began composing a different kind of message. "Dear Sarah, you don't know me, but by the time you read this, you'll have received my bone marrow. Your father and I have a complex history, but some debts can only be paid forward, not back." The city lights grew brighter as night fell. From her window, Victoria could see the Elite Motors billboard, its promise of luxury and exclusivity now seeming hollow. Tomorrow she would give Sarah Thompson a second chance at life, just as she and Marcus S.R. had once given Blake a second chance at success. Her oncologist's words echoed in her mind, "This donation will significantly shorten your time," but as Victoria sealed the letter to Sarah, she knew that time wasn't measured in days or months, but in the lives we touch and the changes we inspire. Sometimes, she wrote in her final paragraph to Sarah, "The greatest luxury isn't in what we own, but in what we can give away. Your father once understood this. Perhaps through you, he will remember." Victoria signed the letter, knowing it would be delivered only after both the donation and her death. Some lessons, after all, are best taught through sacrifice. The late evening shadows stretched across Blake Thompson's office as Marcus Bennett Jr. strode through the door, his father's leather briefcase in hand. The security footage from Elite Motors still played silently on Blake's computer screen, showing Victoria's arrest on loop, a reminder of how quickly fortunes could change. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus began, his voice carrying the quiet authority his mother had perfected. "We need to discuss 3 things: my father's death, your daughter's treatment, and the choice you have to make in the next hour." He placed 3 files on Blake's immaculate desk, each one landing with the weight of decades of secrets. Blake's hand instinctively moved toward his phone, but Marcus shook his head. "James Whitman won't be able to help you tonight. He's currently discussing old memories with Detective Chen." The color drained from Blake's face as Marcus opened the first file, revealing photographs from 25 years ago. Blake, Marcus S.R., and James Whitman standing outside the original Elite Motors location. "It's fascinating," Marcus continued, his fingers tracing the edge of an old investment note. "How one act of kindness can spiral into so many betrayals." He laid out the evidence methodically: encrypted emails, financial transactions, the medical examiner's updated report on Marcus S.R.'s death. "My father discovered the embezzlement scheme, didn't he? But he was willing to handle it quietly, give you another chance. That's why Whitman had to silence him." Blake's hands trembled as he reached for his desk drawer where the old note from his anonymous benefactor still lay. "Marcus, you don't understand. Whitman had evidence about my father's dealings. He threatened to expose everything, ruin Sarah's future before it began. I never wanted to be a part of my father's death," Marcus finished, his voice sharp as steel. "And yet here we are, 25 years later, watching you have my mother arrested for trying to buy a car." He played a video on his phone, security footage from the hospital showing Blake desperately trying to secure funding for Sarah's treatment. "Your daughter has 24 hours to begin treatment if she wants the best chance of survival," Marcus stated, opening the second file. "The only compatible donor in the database is my mother, the same woman you had dragged out of your showroom in handcuffs." He let the irony settle in the air between them. Blake collapsed into his chair, the weight of his choices visible in every line of his face. "Why are you here, Marcus? To watch me beg? To destroy what's left of my life?" Marcus opened the third file, revealing 2 documents: a full confession from James Whitman and a donor consent form signed by Victoria Bennett. "I'm here because my mother taught me that justice without mercy is just another form of vengeance. And my father believed that everyone deserves a second chance, even those who may not seem to deserve it." The city lights twinkled beyond the window as Marcus laid out the choice: option 1, we release everything, the evidence about my father's death, your involvement with Whitman, the discrimination incident. Elite Motors falls, the acquisition fails, and Sarah loses her chance at treatment. Blake's breath caught as Marcus continued. "Option 2, you signed this." He slid across a document: a transfer of Elite Motors ownership to a new foundation dedicated to providing automotive training and employment opportunities to underprivileged youth. "The foundation will be named after my father and your daughter. You'll remain as manager, but with a board of directors focused on community impact." "And Sarah's treatment," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. "My mother has already agreed to the donation, despite knowing it will significantly reduce her remaining time." Marcus's voice caught slightly. "She believes, as my father did, that sometimes the greatest investment we can make is in someone's potential for change." Blake stared at the documents before him, seeing for the first time the full tapestry of choices and consequences that had led to this moment. Your mother, she knew about all of this. Marcus nodded, pulling out one final piece of paper, a note in Victoria's handwriting. "Blake, by the time you read this, the donation for Sarah will be complete. Some debts can only be paid forward. Make this second chance count, not just for Sarah, but for all the others who need someone to believe in them. The clock on Blake's wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside his office, the Elite Motors showroom gleamed with luxury cars that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the weight of the choice before him. The same choice his younger self had faced 25 years ago, between pride and redemption, between appearance and substance. Marcus stood, straightening his jacket. "You have 1 hour, Mr. Thompson. Choose wisely this time, not just for yourself, but for Sarah." The video of Victoria Bennett's arrest went viral by midnight, igniting a firestorm that divided the city. Local news stations played the footage on loop, a distinguished black woman in designer clothing being led out of Elite Motors in handcuffs, her dignity intact even as Blake Thompson's laughter echoed in the background. Elite Motors' discrimination and justice for Victoria trended nationally, but the responses revealed deeper fault lines in society. This isn't just about one luxury car dealership, civil rights attorney Rachel Martinez declared on CNN. This is about the persistent reality of discrimination in high-end retail. Even in 2024, wealth doesn't shield you from racism. The camera cut to footage of protesters gathering outside Elite Motors, their signs illuminated by the dealership's prestigious logo. But social media told a more complex story. As Victoria's identity as CEO of Bennett Financial Group became public, competing narratives emerged. Some praised her restraint, sharing stories of similar experiences in luxury stores. Others, including several of Blake's longtime customers, defended him, claiming the incident was being blown out of proportion for political gain. The story took an unexpected turn when an anonymous source leaked information about Victoria's terminal illness and her status as a potential donor for Sarah Thompson. The New York Times ran a front-page story, "Beyond Discrimination, a Tale of Life, Death, and Redemption at Elite Motors." The public's reaction fractured further. "Are we supposed to forget this man's actions just because his daughter needs help?" demanded social justice activist Michael Chin on Twitter. "Having a sick child doesn't excuse racism." His tweet garnered thousands of retweets, spawning heated debates about forgiveness versus accountability. Meanwhile, local news crews camped outside Memorial Sloan Kettering captured Sarah Thompson arriving for pre-treatment tests, her father shielding her from cameras. The image of the teenager, fragile but determined, clutching her sketchbook of car designs, humanized a story that had become increasingly polarized. Judge William Harrison broke his usual silence to release a statement. "As a witness to the events at Elite Motors, I can attest to the blatant discrimination. However, the greater story here is about the choice between justice and mercy, a choice Ms. Bennett appears to have already made." The business world watched with keen interest as rumors circulated about Elite Motors' pending sale to luxury automotive group. Financial analysts debated the implications on Bloomberg. This could be a watershed moment for corporate accountability in the luxury retail sector. Inside Elite Motors, employees were divided. An anonymous sales associate leaked internal emails showing a pattern of discriminatory practices. Others defended Blake, sharing stories of his quiet charitable works, including the anonymous funding of automotive training programs for underprivileged youth. The story hit fever pitch when someone connected Victoria Bennett to the anonymous investment that had saved Elite Motors 25 years ago. Full circle, how Elite Motors' victim was once its savior. Ran as a headline in the Wall Street Journal, accompanied by the old photograph of Blake Thompson and Marcus Bennett Sr. Religious leaders joined the discourse, with Reverend James Miller's sermon going viral. In choosing to help save the child of her persecutor, Mrs. Bennett shows us the true meaning of grace. Yet critics argued that focusing on forgiveness shifted responsibility away from addressing systemic discrimination. Dr. Patricia Wong, a sociology professor at Columbia, published an op-ed analyzing the public's reaction. The Elite Motors incident forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about wealth, race, and redemption in modern America. Can good deeds offset past wrongs? Does suffering grant immunity from accountability? As protests continued outside Elite Motors, a counter-movement emerged. Former recipients of Blake's anonymous charitable giving began sharing their stories using the full story. A young mechanic's TikTok went viral. Blake Thompson paid for my technical school through his foundation. People can change. They deserve the chance to prove it. Sarah Thompson from her hospital room posted her first and only comment on the controversy. I'm learning that the same world that can show such cruelty can also reveal incredible grace. Please respect our privacy as we navigate this journey. The post humanized the debate, reminding people that real lives hung in the balance. Local news captured the moment Marcus Bennett Jr. arrived at Elite Motors carrying his father's old briefcase, while simultaneously showing Victoria Bennett being prepared for the bone marrow donation procedure. The parallel images sparked fresh debates about justice, redemption, and the price of forgiveness. As evening fell, protesters on both sides gathered outside Elite Motors, their candles creating a sea of light. Among them, a group of Sarah's classmates held signs reading "Hate and hope can't coexist and choose love." The image went viral, becoming the defining photograph of a day that forced a city to confront its contradictions. Inside the hospital, Victoria Bennett prepared for a procedure that would shorten her life to save her persecutor's daughter, while outside the world debated whether she was a saint or a fool. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the complex middle ground where justice meets mercy. The harsh fluorescent lights of Memorial Sloan Kettering's intensive care unit cast a sickly glow over Sarah Thompson's pale face as her condition deteriorated. The monitors beeped with increasing urgency, each sound a reminder that time was running out. In the corner of the room, Blake Thompson slumped in a chair, his designer suit wrinkled, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from lawyers, reporters, and board members. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Anderson spoke softly, entering the room with fresh test results. Sarah's numbers are dropping faster than we anticipated. The window for successful treatment is narrowing. He paused, glancing at the muted TV where footage of protests outside Elite Motors played on loop. Victoria Bennett is being prepped for the procedure now, but given her condition. Blake's hands trembled as he reached for Sarah's sketchbook, left open to a design for a restored vintage Aston Martin, her dream project for after recovery. The irony of his situation crushed him. The same car brand that had triggered this nightmare might now symbolize his daughter's last unfulfilled wish. His phone lit up with another message. Luxury Automotive Group was officially withdrawing their acquisition offer. The statement cited irreconcilable reputational damages and ethical concerns. The $50 million deal that would have secured Sarah's complete treatment plan had evaporated, along with any hope of maintaining control of Elite Motors. "Dad," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes fluttering open. "I saw the video of what happened at the dealership." Blake froze, his heart shattering as tears formed in his daughter's eyes. "The donor. It's her, isn't it? The woman you had arrested." Before Blake could respond, alarms began blaring. Sarah's blood pressure was dropping dangerously low. Dr. Anderson rushed in with a team of nurses, their urgent actions a choreographed dance of medical necessity. "We need to move up the timeline," he announced, locking eyes with Blake. "It's now or never." In the adjacent room, Victoria Bennett lay on a hospital bed, reviewing consent forms despite her obvious exhaustion. Her own oncologist had warned that the donation could reduce her remaining time to mere weeks, yet her hand was steady as she signed each page. Marcus Jr. burst into Sarah's room, his face tense with urgency. "The board is convening an emergency meeting. They're voting to remove you within the hour." He held up his phone, showing Elite Motors' plummeting stock price. "But none of that matters right now. Mom's ready. She's asking for you, Blake." The machines monitoring Sarah's vital signs continued their ominous chorus as Blake followed Marcus to Victoria's room. The woman he had humiliated just days ago lay there, already draped in surgical prep cloths, yet somehow maintaining the same dignified bearing she'd shown in his showroom. "Mr. Thompson," Victoria's voice was soft but clear. "Before we proceed, there's something you need to know." She nodded to Marcus, who produced a file containing evidence about his father's death. "I've known about this for years. Your involvement, James Whitman's manipulation, all of it." Blake's legs gave out, and he sank into a chair. "Why was all he could manage? Why help Sarah after what I've done?" "Because 25 years ago, my husband believed in second chances," Victoria replied, wincing slightly as the pre-procedure medications began flowing through her IV. He saw potential in a desperate young car dealer, potential that's still there beneath all that pride and prejudice. The monitors in Sarah's room began wailing again. Dr. Anderson appeared at the door, his expression grave. "We need to begin now." As medical teams prepared both rooms for the procedure, Blake Thompson faced the culmination of 25 years of choices. Outside, his business empire crumbled. His phone buzzed one final time. The board's decision was unanimous. Elite Motors would no longer be his. "Sarah's designs," Victoria said, suddenly gesturing to the sketchbook Blake still clutched. "She has her father's eye for cars and her own vision for inclusion. Perhaps that's the future Elite Motors needs." Before Blake could respond, the medical team began wheeling Victoria toward the operating room. She caught his hand as she passed, her grip surprisingly strong. "Remember this moment, Blake. Remember what it feels like to need help, to be at someone's mercy. Let it change you, not destroy you." As both patients were prepped for surgery, Blake Thompson stood in the hospital hallway, caught between two rooms, one holding his daughter's future, the other holding the woman whose life he'd dismissed so easily, now offering her remaining time to save Sarah. On the TV overhead, Elite Motors' iconic sign was being covered by protesters' banners, while his phone displayed the final message from the board, effective immediately. In that sterile hospital corridor, as machines beeped and medical teams rushed past, Blake Thompson finally understood what his mentor had tried to teach him 25 years ago. Success wasn't measured in cars sold or deals closed, but in lives touched and changes made. The question was whether this realization had come too late for both his daughter and his soul. We share these powerful stories of redemption, forgiveness, and human connection to inspire hope and understanding. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing meaningful narratives that challenge us to be better humans. Together, we can make a difference. In the recovery room of Memorial Sloan Kettering, Victoria Bennett drifted in and out of consciousness, the bone marrow donation having taken more from her already weakened body than her doctors had anticipated. The monitors beeped steadily, but their rhythm was slower, more deliberate, like a countdown she couldn't stop. Through the haze of medication, she heard Dr. Anderson discussing her condition with Marcus Jr. The procedure was successful, but the strain on her system. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We're looking at weeks now, not months. She knew the risks, Marcus. Your mother made her choice." Victoria stirred, trying to focus on her son's face. Marcus looked so much like his father in that moment, the same worried furrow between his brows, the same determined set to his jaw. She wanted to tell him it was okay, that some prices were worth paying, but her voice wouldn't cooperate. Instead, she squeezed his hand weakly, drawing his attention. On the small table beside her bed lay two envelopes, one addressed to Sarah Thompson, the other to Blake. "Make sure," she whispered, "make sure they understand about second chances." The afternoon sun painted patterns on her hospital room wall, reminding her of the way light had played across the Aston Martin in Elite Motors showroom. She smiled faintly at the memory, no longer bitter. The keys to the car she'd planned to surprise Marcus with were in her purse, along with a note explaining why she'd chosen forgiveness over vengeance. Dr. Anderson returned with her latest test results, his face grave. The cancer had accelerated, spurred by the stress of the donation procedure. "You bought Sarah time," he said softly, "but at a steep cost." Victoria managed a weak smile. "Time," she murmured, "is what we make of it." Her eyes drifted to the window, where autumn leaves danced on the breeze. "Marcus," she called, her voice suddenly clearer, "remember what your father said about justice." "That it's worthless without mercy," Marcus answered, holding back tears. "And about investments." "The best ones aren't in things, but in people," he replied, understanding finally dawning in his eyes about why she'd chosen to help Sarah. Victoria nodded, satisfaction crossing her tired features. Even as her strength ebbed, she had one more lesson to teach, perhaps her most important one. On her bedside table, her journal lay open to her final entry. "In the end, we are measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we give away. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in winning the battle, but in changing the heart of your opponent." As twilight approached, Victoria Bennett rested in her hospital bed, having given her remaining time to save the daughter of a man who had scorned her. Outside her room, Blake Thompson stood silently, watching through the window, the weight of understanding finally settling on his shoulders. Some lessons, after all, come at a price higher than any luxury car could command. Blake Thompson sat in the hospital chapel, his designer suit rumpled, his normally immaculate appearance as disheveled as his thoughts. Sarah's recovery was progressing well, her body accepting Victoria's bone marrow as if recognizing the grace behind the gift. But the weight of what that gift had cost sat heavy on his shoulders. Through the chapel's stained glass windows, dawn painted kaleidoscope patterns on the floor reminiscent of the way sunlight used to play across the cars in his showroom. Elite Motors wasn't his anymore. The board's decision had been unanimous. Yet somehow that loss felt trivial compared to the transformation happening within him. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Anderson's voice echoed in the quiet space. "Victoria's asking for you." The doctor's tone carried an urgency that made Blake's heart sink. Rising on unsteady legs, he followed, each step feeling like a march toward judgment. In his pocket, he carried the worn note from 25 years ago, the anonymous investment that had saved his business, now revealed to be from the Bennetts. The paper had grown soft with age, its message about second chances more poignant than ever. Everyone deserves a chance to prove their worth. Make it count. Outside Victoria's room, he paused, watching through the window as she spoke with Marcus Jr. Even diminished by illness and the donation procedure, she maintained a dignity that made him ashamed of his previous behavior. The security footage from Elite Motors played endlessly in his mind, each replay revealing new layers of his own prejudice and pride. Sarah's sketchbook lay open on his lap, filled with designs for inclusive luxury car showroom spaces where everyone would feel welcome. His daughter's vision for the future stood in stark contrast to the exclusionary empire he'd built. "Dad," she'd said earlier, "maybe losing Elite Motors isn't the end. Maybe it's the beginning of something better." Blake touched the glass separating him from Victoria's room, remembering how easily he'd dismissed her that day at the dealership. Now, watching her life ebb away partly because of her choice to save Sarah, he understood what true luxury meant, not the cars he sold, but the capacity for forgiveness he'd never thought to cultivate. The transformation wasn't just external. Each breath felt different, as if he were learning to exist in a new skin. The man who had laughed while calling security was becoming a stranger to him, replaced by someone who finally understood the weight of his actions and the cost of redemption. Dr. Anderson touched his shoulder gently. "She doesn't have much time left, whatever you need to say." Blake nodded, straightening his tie in a habitual gesture that now felt meaningless. In his other pocket was his resignation letter from Elite Motors, not required since he'd been removed, but necessary for his own conscience. Before entering Victoria's room, he looked once more at Sarah's sketches for a reimagined Elite Motors. Perhaps his daughter had inherited not just Victoria's bone marrow, but also her vision for a more inclusive world. Some transformations come too late for redemption, but right on time for revelation. In his mother's hospital room, Marcus Bennett Jr. stood at the window, the evidence that could destroy Blake Thompson burning a hole in his briefcase. The sun was setting over Manhattan, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror his internal struggle. At the desk beside him lay two documents, his father's old case file about Blake's involvement in his death, and Sarah Thompson's latest recovery report. "You're still angry," Victoria observed weakly from her bed, her voice barely above a whisper but still carrying that perceptive edge that had guided him throughout his life. "You're wondering if forgiveness means letting go of justice for your father." Marcus turned, studying his mother's face, thinner now but still radiating the wisdom that had built their empire. He was involved in Dad's death, Mom. Even if Whitman pulled the strings, Blake knew. He chose his silence over our family. Victoria motioned for him to sit beside her, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "Your father once told me that the hardest cases aren't about finding justice, but about deciding what justice means." She paused, catching her breath. "Look at Sarah's recovery charts again." Marcus glanced at the medical reports. Sarah's numbers were improving dramatically, her body accepting Victoria's bone marrow as if recognizing the sacrifice behind it. One good deed doesn't erase past crimes, he argued, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Victoria agreed, "but sometimes justice comes in forms we don't expect." She nodded toward her journal, where she'd been documenting her thoughts during treatment. "Blake's punishment isn't in what we could do to him, but in what he must live with the knowledge that his daughter's life was saved by someone he despised." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture reminiscent of his father. The evidence in his briefcase could still bring Blake down, ensure he never rebuilt his reputation or business. Yet Sarah's sketches for reimagining Elite Motors as an inclusive luxury brand lay atop the damning documents, her vision for the future challenging his desire for vengeance. "What would Dad want?" he asked, finally voicing the question that had haunted him since discovering the truth. Victoria smiled faintly. "Your father believed in transformation more than punishment. That's why he helped Blake in the first place." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Sometimes the greatest justice is in giving someone the chance to become better than they were." Outside, the city lights began twinkling on, each one a reminder of lives interconnected in ways they couldn't fully understand. Marcus thought of Sarah, recovering 2 floors below, carrying within her the literal essence of forgiveness in his mother's donated marrow. "The choice isn't between justice and mercy," Victoria whispered, reading his thoughts as she always had. "It's between holding onto the past and building a better future." She nodded toward her purse, where the Aston Martin keys still waited. "Some gifts cost more than money, son. The question is, are we strong enough to give them?" Marcus looked at the evidence one last time, understanding finally that true justice might lie not in what he could prove, but in what he chose to let go. Victoria Bennett signed the final documents with a steady hand, despite her weakening condition. The papers before her would transfer control of Elite Motors not to Marcus Jr., as everyone expected, but to a new foundation co-chaired by Sarah Thompson and a board of community leaders. Beside her, Dr. Anderson watched with a mixture of admiration and concern as she detailed her last major decision. "The Bennett Thompson Foundation for Inclusive Luxury," she read aloud, savoring each word. "Where everyone deserves a chance to dream." Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of decades of experience fighting barriers others had placed in her way. Through the window of her hospital room, she could see the Elite Motors billboard being transformed, workers carefully replacing the old slogan with the foundation's new mission statement. Sarah, now recovering steadily thanks to the bone marrow donation, had designed the new logo herself, an elegant fusion of luxury and accessibility. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "After everything Blake did." Victoria smiled, touching the small photo of Marcus S.R. she kept by her bedside. "Your father understood something I've only now fully grasped. True change doesn't come from punishment, but from transformation." She paused, gathering strength. Blake's greatest punishment was living with the knowledge that his daughter's life was saved by someone he deemed unworthy. His greatest redemption will be watching her transform his legacy into something better. The Foundation's charter laid out a clear vision: Elite Motors would become a pioneer in inclusive luxury retail, offering apprenticeships to underprivileged youth, establishing scholarship programs for aspiring automotive engineers, and creating a new standard for how high-end businesses treat all customers. Sarah has her father's eye for cars, Victoria observed, watching the young woman sketching designs in the garden below, but she has her own vision for justice. Sometimes our children succeed not by following our path, but by forging a better one. Dr. Anderson returned with her latest test results, his expression grave. The donation had accelerated her decline significantly, but Victoria's face showed no regret. Instead, she reached for one final document, a letter to be delivered to Blake after her passing. "Tell him," she instructed Marcus, "that some debts can only be paid forward. His daughter carries part of me now, just as he once carried your father's faith in his potential. The circle closes, but the journey continues." As twilight settled over the city, Victoria Bennett rested in her hospital bed, watching the last rays of sun glint off the newly installed Foundation sign. Her decision to transform Elite Motors from a symbol of exclusion to a beacon of opportunity had cost her precious time, but as she observed Sarah teaching other young patients about car design from her wheelchair, she knew it was worth every moment. Sometimes, she whispered to Marcus, echoing his father's words from long ago, "Luxury isn't about what we can buy, but what we choose to give away." Her sacrifice had bought not just Sarah's life, but a chance to heal wounds deeper than any discrimination, creating a legacy that would outlive both prejudice and pride. 1 month after Victoria Bennett's bone marrow donation, the grand reopening of Elite Motors drew a crowd that spanned the social spectrum. The showroom, once a fortress of exclusivity, had been transformed. Gone were the intimidating security guards and velvet ropes. In their place stood a diverse team of sales professionals, many graduates of the Foundation's new training program. Sarah Thompson, still recovering but growing stronger each day, cut the ribbon alongside Marcus Jr. The new logo she'd designed gleamed above them, a stylized bridge merging with a luxury car's silhouette, symbolizing the Foundation's mission to bridge social divides through opportunity. "Welcome to the Bennett Thompson Foundation for Inclusive Luxury," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the strength of her mother's donated marrow, "where everyone's dreams have value." Behind her, the showroom's central display featured her first project, a restored vintage Aston Martin, modified to be wheelchair accessible, its elegant lines proving that accessibility and luxury could coexist beautifully. Blake Thompson stood quietly at the back, transformed by humility. His daughter's vision for the dealership had surpassed anything he could have imagined. The apprenticeship program, training underprivileged youth in automotive technology and business, already had a waiting list hundreds deep. The scholarship fund, named in Victoria's honor, would send 2 students to engineering school each year. The Foundation's boardroom, once Blake's private sanctuary, now displayed photos of Victoria and Marcus Sr., alongside the dealership's history. Their initial investment in Blake's potential had come full circle, transforming not just a business but an industry's approach to inclusion. Local media covered the launch extensively, focusing on the Foundation's innovative programs, the Dreams and Drive initiative providing internships to inner-city youth, the Women in Automotive Mentorship program, and the Luxury for All financing program, making high-end vehicles accessible to qualified buyers regardless of their background. Dr. Anderson attended the ceremony, watching Sarah with professional pride and personal amazement. Her recovery had exceeded all expectations, as if Victoria's marrow carried not just healing but purpose. The medical partnership between Memorial Sloan Kettering and the Foundation would ensure other patients received the same chance at life, regardless of their ability to pay. The showroom's new design, implemented according to Sarah's sketches, eliminated traditional barriers between customers and vehicles. Interactive displays told stories of automotive pioneers from diverse backgrounds, while the customer lounge hosted regular community events and educational programs. As evening approached, Marcus Jr. unveiled the foundation's centerpiece, a scholarship program for children affected by discrimination in retail settings. My mother believed. He announced, his voice thick with emotion, that the greatest luxury we can offer is the opportunity to prove prejudice wrong. The Bennett Thompson Foundation had become more than a redemption story. It was a blueprint for change in the luxury retail sector. Other high-end dealerships were already reaching out, seeking guidance on implementing similar inclusive practices. Sarah's first graduating class of apprentices lined up in their uniforms, representing every background imaginable. Their presence in the showroom wasn't just about selling cars, it was about selling possibility. Above them, Victoria's words had been etched into the wall: true luxury is measured not by who we exclude, but by who we lift up along the way. Within 6 months of the Bennett Thompson Foundation's establishment, its impact rippled through the luxury retail sector like a stone dropped in still water. The story of Victoria's sacrifice and Sarah's transformation had become a Harvard Business School case study, examining how personal redemption could catalyze institutional change. Elite Motors sales had actually increased, drawing a new clientele who valued both luxury and social responsibility. The showroom's diverse staff, trained through the Foundation's programs, achieved record customer satisfaction scores. More significantly, other high-end retailers began adopting similar inclusive practices, recognizing that exclusivity could coexist with accessibility. Local youth programs reported unprecedented engagement. The Foundation's Future in Gear initiative had partnered with 20 schools in underprivileged areas, providing automotive technology education and career pathways. Sarah, between her treatments, personally mentored young women interested in automotive design, her own experience bridging worlds that once seemed impossibly far apart. The impact extended beyond retail. Major corporations began examining their own practices, with several luxury brands hiring Foundation consultants to revamp their approach to diversity. The Victoria Bennett Standard became shorthand for ethical luxury retail, emphasizing that high-end products could maintain their prestige while becoming more accessible. In hospital waiting rooms across the city, the Foundation's presence was felt through its medical assistance program. Inspired by Victoria's sacrifice, wealthy donors contributed to a fund ensuring that no family would face Sophie's impossible choice between treatment and financial ruin. Community leaders noticed subtle but significant changes. The prestigious shopping districts, once infamous for profiling incidents, now hosted regular events celebrating diversity in luxury markets. Security guards received cultural sensitivity training, while sales staff underwent regular bias awareness programs. Former critics of Elite Motors became its strongest advocates. The same social media influencers who had once called for boycotts now showcased the dealership's transformation as a model for corporate evolution. Their followers watched as Sarah's innovative designs proved that inclusive luxury wasn't just ethical, it was profitable. Perhaps most telling was the change in industry statistics. Reports showed a marked decrease in discrimination complaints across luxury retail sectors, while diversity in high-end sales positions increased by 40% citywide. The Foundation's apprenticeship graduates were highly sought after, their training in both technical skills and cultural competency setting new industry standards. Blake Thompson, working now under his daughter's leadership, found himself teaching seminars on transformation and inclusive business practices. His story of redemption, painful though it was, provided a powerful testament to the possibility of change. The Foundation's quarterly community forums became must-attend events, where luxury retailers shared best practices for inclusive excellence. Sarah's designs for accessible luxury vehicles had caught the attention of major manufacturers, leading to industry-wide innovations in inclusive automotive design. As the Foundation's first anniversary approached, Dr. Anderson presented surprising data at a medical conference. Statistics showed that inclusive business practices correlated with reduced stress levels in minority communities, leading to measurable health benefits. Victoria's vision of transforming one act of discrimination into a movement for change had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The Foundation stood as living proof that some gifts, given at great cost, could multiply their impact far beyond their original intention. 1 year to the day after Victoria Bennett's passing, Sarah Thompson stood at the podium in Elite Motors' transformed showroom, her strength fully restored, her purpose unshakable. The annual Bennett-Thompson Foundation Gala had drawn leaders from across the luxury retail sector, all eager to learn from what Forbes had dubbed the Elite Motors miracle. A year ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying her mother's donated strength. This showroom was a symbol of exclusion. Today it stands for something my biological father had to learn, and my spiritual mother always knew that true luxury lies in lifting others up. Behind her, screens displayed photographs of Victoria Bennett alongside testimonials from the Foundation's program graduates. Blake Thompson sat in the front row, transformed by humility and purpose. His designer suit, once a symbol of superiority, now seemed less like armor and more like a uniform of service. The evidence Marcus Jr. had chosen not to release still sat in a safety deposit box, a reminder of how close they'd come to choosing vengeance over redemption. The showroom itself told the story of transformation, where security guards once profiled customers, apprentices from diverse backgrounds now welcome visitors. The space where Victoria Bennett had been handcuffed now hosted a permanent exhibition on the history of discrimination in luxury retail, teaching future generations about the cost of prejudice and the power of forgiveness. But perhaps the most powerful testament to change was the small detail few noticed. On Sarah's desk in her design studio upstairs sat 2 framed photographs, one of her biological father in his early days at Elite Motors, and one of Victoria Bennett on the day she chose to give Sarah a future at the cost of her own. Between them stood a model of Sarah's latest design, an accessible luxury vehicle named the Victoria, bridging the gap between exclusivity and inclusivity, just as its namesake had done with her final act of grace. During the gala's closing moments, Marcus Jr. approached the podium with an unexpected announcement. In his hands, he held a sealed envelope discovered in his mother's personal effects, marked to be opened 1 year after. The room fell silent as he broke the seal. "My dearest Sarah and Blake," Victoria's words echoed through the showroom. "If this letter is being read, then our story of transformation has continued beyond my time. But there's one final truth you need to know." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he read on. The letter revealed that 25 years ago, when Victoria and Marcus Sr. saved Elite Motors through their anonymous investment, they had discovered something extraordinary. Blake Thompson's father had once saved Marcus Sr.'s life during the Vietnam War, taking a bullet that would have killed him. The investment wasn't just an act of kindness, it was repaying a debt that had gone unspoken for decades. Sarah gasped audibly as Marcus continued reading. Victoria's letter explained how she had tracked Blake's father's medical records while researching Sarah's condition, discovering that the same rare blood disorder that afflicted Sarah had claimed her grandfather's life. Victoria's bone marrow donation wasn't just an act of forgiveness, it was completing a circle of life-saving that had begun a generation earlier. Sometimes Victoria's letter concluded, "The debts we owe and the grace we receive are part of a larger story we can't see until the end. Blake, your father saved my husband. I saved your daughter. And now Sarah will save others through the Foundation. This is the true meaning of legacy." Blake Thompson stood slowly, tears streaming down his face as decades of connection suddenly became clear. The photograph in his wallet, the one of his father in military uniform that he'd carried for years, now held new meaning. In the background of that faded image, barely visible, stood a young Marcus Bennett, Sr. The revelation transformed the Foundation's origin story from one of redemption to one of generational interconnection. Sarah's innovative designs, Blake's hard-earned wisdom, Marcus Jr.'s legal expertise, and Victoria's final sacrifice weren't just random elements of change, they were threads in a tapestry that had been weaving itself for half a century. As the letter's contents spread through the gathered crowd, the showroom filled with a profound sense of destiny fulfilled. Victoria Bennett's final gift hadn't just been her bone marrow, it had been the truth that bound them all together in ways they never imagined. As the gala drew to a close, Dr. Anderson stepped forward with one final revelation that would complete Victoria Bennett's legacy. In his hands, he held research data showing that Sarah's recovery had led to a groundbreaking discovery. Her unique response to Victoria's bone marrow had created antibodies that could help treat other patients with the same rare blood condition. The Bennett Thompson Medical Research Fund, Sarah announced, standing alongside Marcus Jr., will ensure that my mother's gift continues to save lives. She unveiled plans for a new wing at Memorial Sloan Kettering dedicated to studying and treating rare blood disorders, particularly in underserved communities. But the true twist came in Blake Thompson's response. Standing at the podium, he revealed that he'd been anonymously funding medical research into the same condition for years, driven by guilt over his father's death. The research, combined with Sarah's case study, had created a breakthrough that would help countless others. Victoria didn't just save my daughter, Blake's voice cracked with emotion. She completed a circle my father started. Now, through the Foundation and this research, that circle will keep expanding. He announced that the entire Thompson family fortune would be dedicated to the Medical Research Fund, transforming Elite Motors' luxury car showroom into a symbol of how privilege could be redirected toward healing. As the evening ended, Sarah unveiled her latest design, a mobility vehicle that combined luxury with accessibility, named the Legacy. Its logo incorporated elements from both the Bennett and Thompson family crests, symbolizing how two families, once divided by prejudice, had been united by sacrifice and grace. Victoria Bennett's final message, projected above the showroom, captured the essence of their journey. True luxury isn't in what we possess, but in what we give away. Every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, creates ripples that touch lives we may never know. If this story of redemption, sacrifice, and healing touched your heart, please take a moment to support our team by subscribing to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue creating meaningful content that explores the depths of human connection and transformation. Don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with your friends and family, everyone who needs a reminder that change is possible and forgiveness has power. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Has discrimination touched your life? How did you handle it? And should we create part 2 exploring Sarah's journey as she builds her father's legacy? Let us know in the comments. Together we can spread stories that matter.